starts with this umbrella term that we'll go ahead and kind of utilize here called malware. And you may be familiar with that, but if not, then I'm going to decompose it for you. It's pretty easy. It stands for malicious software, right? And there's a whole bunch of things that are qualified underneath malware, and that includes what you see up here on the screen. One of the most interesting ones, in my opinion here, my little thing down, my opinion, is this worm right here. The worm, we haven't seen a really nasty one come out in a while, but the difference between a virus and a worm is self-replicating, whereas a virus needs a host to infect. Well, what does that mean? That means that the worm doesn't have to be attached to a file. It just needs an open network connection to something. And it's very tricky to contain a worm. But here is a keyword that I want you to make sure that you look at. And let's just talk about this here for a second. What does the word exploitation mean? Well, underneath it here, we got it, gain unauthorized access to system resources. Well, in order for us to exploit something, we have to know what a vulnerability is, right? So let's say that I'm going to go and Aditi and I are going to be in a mixed martial arts fight. We're going to go into the octagon, right? You versus me. If I'm her opponent, I'm going to try to find, within the first 20 to 30 seconds of us finding ourselves inside of that ring, I'm going to see, is she left-handed or right-handed? Is she limping? I'm going to try to find potentially a hole in her defenses that I can begin to pick on. She's got a scab, I'm going to pick at it, right? But I'm trying to find a vulnerability. And so when we go out and do these assessments on people's networks, first thing we do is a vulnerability assessment. We've got to find where those scabs are. Right? We've got to find those open holes that are on the network, and we do that by running scanners and figuring out what ports and protocols are open on their network. And so in that metaphor, being able to look at the person that you're up against and figuring out where their deficiencies are, well, because that is the thing that as security professionals we do. Look for vulnerabilities and we figure out how can we patch those vulnerabilities. We do gap assessments, which means this is where you're supposed to be, this is where you are, how do you get to where you need to be. Typically with Microsoft, you hear about Patch Tuesdays. Those patches are typically from zero-day exploits. Now, as a EC Council certified ethical hacker instructor, master instructor, I can tell you that EC Council has done a lot of research on that, on 0 days. And specifically, they say on average, based off the research that they've done, that a 0-day exploit typically goes unnoticed in the wild for 72 days. So a 0-day is a piece of malicious software or malware that does something nefarious on a machine. And really, until it's found, you don't really know what it is. But it's kind of like with viruses, when it's found, that becomes the day 0 that it's found. So we call it an O-day or 0-day. The day it's launched till 72 days, that's typically the time that it's out in the wild before it's discovered. So think about that. 72 days, that's what, that's two and a half months almost, roughly, right? 2 days, 2.5 months. What didn't I say right there? That's just when it's discovered. What do we got to do? If we have a piece of software that we're writing, or if we're Microsoft, what do we have to do now? Somebody's discovered a vulnerability. We know it can be exploited by the attackers out there. What do we got to do? We got to patch it, right? So the patch just doesn't, and we got to write the software to actually patch the issue. And so every Tuesday, Microsoft patches their software. And the big transition from any of you guys that are running Windows here, big transition from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and one of the reasons why Microsoft, in at least the first 6 months, made it free was because they wanted to get everybody into the automatic updating of Microsoft patching. Now, you can go in and disable that, but now most people, 90% of the people out there, don't know that they can disable it. And instead of it being kicked down the road, like many of our older people that don't know anything about patching, what we typically see is that they just kick the can down the road. They don't want to patch. And what does that mean? That means their machine is now vulnerable to an exploit. So if I run a vulnerability scan on your machine or on your network, it'll come up with all of these vulnerabilities. And then I, as a security expert, will go through and say, let's see if we can use that one to get on their machine. And in that case, I don't need remote desktop. I can just use that exploit to go and get access control to your machine. I don't even need to use your ID and password. It's an exploit that I can circumvent any access control, any authentication, and I can be on your hard drive lickety split.